Hi, welcome to the Belonging Project podcast. Today I'm with Kerstin, and I'm really excited to have her today and record this episode together. We've known each other for a few years now. We've met through work, through our coaching work. And we've been doing more work together recently, and that's very exciting. And yeah, just generally, I'm looking forward to dive into what belonging means to Kerstin today.
Hi,
Hi,
Fioletta. Thank you
Kirstin.
for having me. I'm really happy to be a part of this today and to continue our conversation on belonging.
To be honest, I feel like it's been overdue. And yes, all right. So let's start with a little bit about you for those in our listeners, for those amongst our listeners who do not know you yet. So, you are an emotional and cultural agility coach, and you're also a facilitator. And you are based in India. You're originally from Germany. And there's so many things that I want to ask you already, kind of related to what I've just shared. And I'm sure that there is much more that you'll add as well. Um, Perhaps we can start with how it was growing up in Germany for you, and then how did the move to India
hmm
happen,
Of
if that would
course.
be okay
Yes,
sharing.
absolutely. Yeah, so I grew up in South Germany, Bavaria. Um, both my parents are originally from the region. Both were born in the same area, but their parents were from different parts of Germany. So we classify, according to the local standards, we still classify as immigrants in a way. We were never fully part of the society that has always been there for generations, but we moved. So even though I spent my whole childhood in the same place, we were kind of the newcomers. And I think that's been a, a first piece of my own search for belonging, was noticing that from a very early age, that I'm obviously somehow from the place. Like, I'm nobody would say, you're not fitting in, but I didn't feel like I was fully of the place. I was fully there. And I think so. I really was interested in family history, for example, for a long period, even before moving to India. I think moving to India has enhanced that interest and my interest in the topic of belonging. But it's been really, if I look back, it's been there since at least adolescence, like my teenage years, to try to understand how so many different generations in my family have defined belonging, because there was a loss of home in one part of the family, and then there was very how to say that, very extensive nomadic lifestyles, like traveling a lot, and never fully arriving anywhere. So that, I think there's a big topic of uprootedness in my family, and I think that we share that probably with a lot of other um, Western families and family systems. Yeah.
I know you have a sibling. I'm curious if the uprootedness or even the sense of belonging, was that something that you talked about with your brother or even with your parents as you were growing up?
It was not a discussion. It was not a topic of conversation. And I think we all had the symptoms of, the uprootedness, but all of us dealt with it in a different way. For me, it was very early on to start looking for belonging in other places. So I started traveling, and then my studies also, I studied international business and culture studies. So it made a lot of sense to be exposed to other places. So that was kind of my approach of finding belonging or identifying it for myself, but it was never really a conversation within the family. It's something that I hope might happen. You know, my sibling also lives abroad. Both of us are away from the context in which we grew up. So who knows? It might happen. You know, to have these conversations now that we both had a chance to explore what belonging means in our lives and have new discussions around that. Yeah.
Yeah. And this is really rather anecdotal what I'm going to share, but from the different people I've met and my own experiences, I feel that the more we've been exposed to kind of uprootedness or having families, members of our family that have moved from one place to another as we were growing up, then perhaps the more inclined we are to move places ourselves when we reach
Absolutely.
adulthood. I don't know if that also matches the experience you
Very
have
much
of
so.
people
Yeah.
around you.
And I think that, and maybe to answer your earlier question about India, that's how that decision came to be, because I do have family history with India. My mother spent almost 13 years of her youngest age in India. I think she went back by 15, maybe. She went back to graduate. So she spent her
Oh, I
whole
didn't know that.
childhood
Oh, wow.
in India.
Okay.
My aunt was born there. My uncle spent his childhood. So because my grandfather was working for a German company in India at that time. And so that's, I think, why India was always top of mind for me. And it took a long time actually to realize that not every family has this kind of um, connection to another culture in such a, in this way,
Mm.
because it's not our culture, but still there was a deep connection somehow. My grandmother used to cook Indian meals, and they had all the rugs shipped from India, and their house looked like an Indian home in many ways. And that's how I grew up, but I never realized until later that this is not, not everybody has grandparents whose home looks, German grandparents whose home looks like an Indian home. And that's something that only connected later for me. And then I actually, developed my own interest in exploring India and living there. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, that is probably something that you didn't find in your
Right.
classmates
Exactly. Yeah.
as you were
Yeah.
going to school.
Or it's not something that was talked about, maybe.
And
I think really also the period that I was growing up in, there was not much conversation around belonging and culture. There was just one very dominant narrative, at least in the region where I grew up. And there was not much deviation visible or accepted or talked about. It was a very homogenic culture, I would say. So I think that's also what made it hard to
Mhm,
talk about these things, because there was no space really.
I see. Tell us a little bit more about what led you to develop perhaps your own interests about India and then later on made
Mm.
you move to India.
I think the interest was there early on. So as I said, it's kind of, I kind of grew up with it without without having a deep knowledge. It was more like something that just happened simultaneously while I was living my life. There were anecdotal, uh, stories about India.
Mm.
And about my family's life in India, which of course was also not a very Indian experience, because they lived in a, at the time, in a very secluded bubble, I would say. Um, and that's the way expat life, so-called expat life, was at that time. It probably still is, but that kind of motivated me to to really experience it for myself. As I was studying, I studied the culture studies, and at that point, halfway between in my studies, after what is now maybe a bachelor degree, I completed the older German degree, which doesn't have that separation. But basically, halfway into my studies, I decided to take a break and came to India for the first time. And very naive and very unprepared, I have to say. I traveled for 2 months and tried to kind of recreate. I went to the places, for example, the old apartments where my family lived. Tried to find them in the city, in Mumbai, and try to make my own, create my own picture of and my own experience of what India is. And I mean, India is too complex to be able to understood in 2 months. So I came back. I was quite overwhelmed. I mean, I was 22 at the time, I think, and I traveled alone. Was very what I now call culture shock. What I didn't realize then, but I was very grappling with the complexity of everything. It was very hard these 2 months, but it was just travel, so I knew I'll come back. And after completing my studies, or then continuing my studies, somehow I still couldn't let India go. Like, it kept popping up. I was focusing on sustainability issues, and especially the energy sector. And India has a huge market in that way. There's a lot of developments, and it's very dynamic. So I was drawn to combine that. Like, in a way, when I look back now, I try to give myself like a rational excuse why I'm interested in coming back to India. But actually, what drove it was really something that I can't really explain. It's more like an inner urge to, and a knowing that I want to be here. And then I kind of found ways to make it possible, and that's by focusing, then writing my final thesis on the Indian energy sector, then finding work in that area in Delhi, and that's kind of what made it possible for me then to shift. But if I'm very honest, I think the initial decision, and it wasn't really I'm going to sit down and now take a decision. It's more something that really happened, that I knew that I want to live in India. It's not something that I can explain beyond this. It's very, yeah, if that makes sense.
Yeah. It almost sounds like it was a visceral kind of push that you had, that this was
Exactly.
meant to be
Exactly.
your next
Exactly.
step.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I really resonated with what you shared around when you first arrived. I think you mentioned you went back to the places where your family lived. So there is almost a kind of
Mm-hmm.
pilgrimage uh, sense to
Mm-hmm.
that, right? You want to understand where they were, where your roots were, how they lived. And I remember when I was growing up, I was very close to my maternal grandmother, and I always loved to ask her questions. And we were living in France, and she was with us, and she grew up in Italy, and so it's not like we could just take the car and drive
Yeah.
and have a look. And I just had all those questions, and it was such a disappointment when then like we couldn't actually go and have a look because other people were living there.
Exactly.
And yeah, just kind of, you want to see how they saw the world
Exactly.
before
Yeah.
you. And
Oh, I
yeah.
love that. Oh, and that gives me
Mm,
such a sense
mhm,
of,
mhm.
because if you look at it, just going to look at a building that, as you said, you can't even enter. It's such a disguised, it's disguising the actual intention, and it's the wanting to understand how their experience was, what they saw, what they made of it. And that's not, you can't find it in a building, but the the urge is there, or the yearning is there to find something to connect to. I think that's the belonging quest somehow. don't you think?
Yeah, like where it's part of finding like where
Yeah,
you came
yeah.
from, right? Not the building as such, but the lives that um it enabled. um yeah. And then what happened? What made you stay? How did that all
No, that's
work
a
out?
bigger story. Let's see. Um, yeah, so after graduating, I got a scholarship, like a postgraduate scholarship for a group of Germans to go to India to have language courses and then work in Indian organizations.
So you
Yes, I
graduated
graduated
from
in
Germany,
Germany,
yeah?
and then 2 months later or so, I joined this postgraduate program, which was a 9 month program, I think. So that was also like an easier transition, maybe because there was a group of us, I think 15 of us, who studied for a month, studied at a university in India, had some basic, I mean, it's very basic language instructions, and started basically settling. No, let me rewind that. Okay, so we, as a group of 15, we came to India together after a month of language programs, some cultural programs or cultural introductions. We all went to different cities to work in Indian organizations as an intern. Basically, it was a postgraduate internship. And that's when I started working in Delhi in the same field that I wrote my thesis on, so in the energy sector. And I had previous connections from Germany in Delhi, which then resulted in a job position. And so it kind of just happened that it continued. I also met my now husband at the time, and that, I think, of course, was one of the deciding factors to know that I'll be staying indefinitely. Um, but it was very clear after these first few months that I don't really see myself going back to Germany, even without having met my husband. I probably would have still not gone back, to be honest. It felt like going back would have been like almost starting from scratch again. And now I had already, established some social circles. I had, my work was getting established, and so it didn't feel like, a big step to stay. It was very clear that I would stay somehow. And again, more like a visceral sense than really a decision. I never really communicated my decision that I'm going to stay in India, because it never felt like, oh, now there's a moment that I can pinpoint after which it is clear that I'm staying. It's just something that developed and stayed with me. So it's yeah, that's the first phase, I would say. But then I was struggling with belonging in my field of work, in my chosen field of work, um, to such a degree that I decided to step out of it. And that really was like the second layer, I would say, of arriving in India, because I completely stepped out of, the German supported circles. I was no longer, I think until then, so the
Mhm.
first 2, 3 years, maybe I would have counted myself as an expat. And then I transitioned into being more of an immigrant, like somebody who's arriving and settling. And I stepped out of all the German circles. I stepped out of my professional networks and completely started over, but with my base in India. And my husband was going through something similar at the same time. So it was quite an intense period for both of us, for a few years, to find our footing again somehow, both of us leaving parts of our identities behind and reorienting and choosing new lives for us individually and together. And I think that was it was
Mm.
actually quite a long period, a couple of years 5 to 6 years, I would even say. And it's only now, I'm in India now for 12 years. It's only this year that there's a sense of real arriving. So, I mean, I'm now really shortcutting a whole process, but it's like it had phases somehow, and I'm only now
Yeah.
at a place where I would say that I'm really here.
Yeah. All right, I want to
Yeah,
unpack this a little bit. What led you to decide that you wanted to step out of the German or just the
yeah.
expat circle in India?
Now I have to be careful how I phrase all of this. Uh, uh, um, when I prepared for this conversation and you were talking about or you're asking about the moments where I struggled with belonging, I think it was that period of coming out of university and stepping into professional life. That was one transition that I was not prepared for. And I think I'm not alone in this. Now I know that I'm not alone in this because I work with people who are going through these transitions. But I was not prepared for the level of, um, how do I say this? Of microaggressions, essentially. Power dynamics that are just playing out without being reflected or being without any intention to mitigate them. And so I felt very uncomfortable feeling sandwiched kind of between the Indian and the German side. I was working in a Indo-German collaboration project where I was a bit like a go-between, and that role did not feel comfortable because I felt I'm carrying messages that I'm not really ready to carry, but that was my work. And so I felt I think it's all a part of my identity process, like finding my place as a white woman living in India. What does that look like? Like, if I don't want to show up in the ways that people have shown up, so let me show you how this works. There's a lot of like power dynamics that come in these projects and in these environments. And I didn't want that, and I also didn't know how else to show up. And so I was really not resourced to hold that tension for a long time. I was very quickly going into burnout and into basically I was in a constant shame response, because now I see it. I was really struggling with how to exist there as a white German woman in a context um, that wasn't, how to say that. See, I'm now looking for words. I think we can cut this later. But there's something. What are you understanding so far about what I shared, or what makes you curious?
There was an unease and um, an observation or realization that there was kind of a world outside of the one that you were in the ecosystem that you were in, that was actually quite different, and you were
Yeah,
not getting a
yeah,
sense of
yeah, yeah,
it.
yeah. There's a. Sorry.
And it
Yeah.
sounds like at
No, no,
oh, sorry, go on.
no. I'm
Go on,
really
go on.
open to hearing. That helped me too.
It sounds like this realization probably overlapped, or perhaps overlapped with a sense of, am I in the right
Exactly.
profession? Am I doing the right thing
Exactly.
professionally?
Yeah. Exactly. Because I mean, I did come, and again, that was before, you know, Fridays for Future and all these big movements that are happening now, which are bringing all these topics much more into the public eye. But that was 2010 or so. Yeah. And I felt there was no, like, there was no clear path for me. It felt like either I'm within the system, now I'm choosing to be within the system, but that means taking on all the power dynamics and as they are and kind of just functioning within it. But there was no sense of how can we do this in a way that how I, because I came to it probably with a lot of idealism, and I think a lot of people enter these fields with a lot of idealism, only to realize that they're finding the same power struggles and dynamics and the same, you know, behaviors, you know, the microaggressions and everything that's going on, and the exclusion that happens, um, in the same, you know, in this realm where they maybe didn't expect it to be, and then coming to terms with the fact, you know, maybe the path forward is not within this, in within the system, but, you know, to really step out and do it differently. And I mean, that's what I ultimately decided to do. But it was a
Hmm.
big search and clarifying, because it means letting go a lot of, I mean, it meant letting go of a lot of security and a lot of connection and a lot of, you know, predictability, because I really stepped out not knowing yet what my work could be if it wasn't that. So yeah, as you're saying, it's really, it's like multiple layers of challenge that I think came together, you know, the pure transition of uh, the professional transition, then not knowing if I'm in the right place or what that right place is actually, and then the cultural layers and, you know, the cultural
Yeah.
adaptation that needed to happen. And I was just arriving. It was just the very beginning of my time here. So yeah,
Yeah. And that resonates as well, to in many different dimensions. When I arrived in London, I was just kind of fresh out of university. I was starting this new job, and I was working for a French bank, and I got sucked in and I think sucked in is the right word, because I didn't really have the time to decide whether I wanted that or not. I got sucked
yeah,
in the network, of expats, of more kind of French expats or French speaking expats. There were Belgians as well. Um, and yeah, and when you're just arriving to a place and you have a non-existing network, it's a little bit like, if you say no to that, then what are you really saying
exactly.
yes to? um and so I feel, kind of reflecting back on that moment, I feel that I have missed out on many many experiences of just moving into to a new place and having to find yourself your first social network, made of people that actually you share an interest with, as opposed to you share a professional relationship, or any of that, or that they just happen to be very nice colleagues. And um a little bit like you, there came a point where I did find that I was not really
Yeah,
belonging, um and that I wanted something more, that it just felt that I was living in a bubble, where actually I didn't need to live in a bubble. And I felt that I was missing out on different layers, different just dimensions of being in London. But it was hard because at the time when I realized it, I had been in the same city for two
Yeah.
years. So the starting from scratch feels different. You probably, I felt that I had lost that buzz of like, oh, I'm new and I want to try this, who's willing, or what is out there. I think I was probably worried of the
Hmm.
judgment, like joining in some groups and all, um outside of my network, and kind of being the new one, but actually I've been here for a
Yeah.
while now. um and yeah, I wish I would have asked myself less questions than what I did, because the more time goes on and the more the
Yeah.
questions are there anyway. But yeah, I completely get it. And the other thing that I wanted to come back on is, you shared that now you feel like there's been a turning point, but that's been very, very recently. So how many years has it been now since you've
I've been
been
in
in
India for
India?
12 years. And I would really say it, and I mean, that could be, I'm not saying that it takes this long for everybody, because I kept, coming from that academic background about on cross-cultural management, I knew what culture shock is. I knew that, what it entails, but I still couldn't recognize it when I was in it. So I would say for the whole middle portion of this period, maybe from after stepping out of, the that previous bubble, until I would say almost 3 years ago. So at least for a good 6 years or so, I was really in like a culture shock freeze almost, and I couldn't recognize it. I couldn't recognize what I was going through was partly informed by me navigating an environment that is foreign, that is not mine, that is where I'm not fluent in the language, where I'm visibly from not from, where I'm visibly, it's almost like I switched the earlier, um, in Germany, I had that sense of not fully belonging because a part of me never felt that these inner dimensions, for example, of life are welcome. In Germany, that's not a really, like, at least in the where I grew up and how I grew up, it's not a part of the conversation. And now I felt more of that inner sense of belonging, knowing that this is where I want to live and build a life. But then that external factor, like being the foreigner, being the immigrant, being and it's not like anybody ever makes me feel like that. Like I've been very warmly welcomed, but it's, I know that there's a, I can't easily bridge all the barriers that are here, or that and there's the social connection is limited by my being different, I would say. So yeah, I think that, so the culture shock piece is something that's really been interesting to work through, because even having all the information, having the knowledge, having the awareness, but then catching it within ourselves and seeing what it does, seeing how it stops us also from engaging with life, and how isolating it can be. It's really one reason why this is such an important part, why culture is such an important part of my work now, because we're not trained nearly enough to understand the implications of it, I believe.
Hmm. And if you had a magic wand and you had an opportunity to say something to the Kirstine of a few years ago, when you were in the midst of the culture shock, what would you tell
That's a
her?
sweet question. Mm, I would probably just reassure her, um, that when we look for belonging, there's bound to be um, uncertainty, and there's bound to be um, not knowing, and this is really your own path. You don't have anybody to ask for orientation because this is your life, and there's there's no yardsticks by which to measure your experience. And I think I would I would encourage her to let that go, that the fear and that panic of, oh my God, is this making sense? It doesn't make sense in the moment. It doesn't make sense, and it can't be communicated to anybody else what you're going through. And within you, it makes sense
Mm.
if you spend time with that. I think that's the message I would have for her. Yeah. Mm.
I love it. I love it. Um, and I hope that this is actually
Totally.
helpful for
Yeah. Yeah, I
any of
hope so.
our listeners
Yeah.
who are going through a culture shock moment. Um, all right. I'm curious to know how you transitioned into coaching and facilitation. And yeah, I'll
Yeah,
stop the
yeah,
question there for
absolutely.
now.
I think that came out of that experience in my first field of work, seeing how little awareness is there for all the parts of collaboration that are necessary so that people can actually do their best work and do their best work across cultures, especially when it's very complex. And since I saw such a lack of, I mean, I'm not saying that there's a lack of it completely, but there was no conversation around these topics. I really went out to explore that on my own. I said, what are the missing pieces here? What is it that these kind of spaces need so that they're more wholesome, or that people can actually make the change that they want to make? Like in my case, I came in a very idealistic way into this whole into the sector, and wanting to make change and wanting to contribute to a more sustainable way of life for everybody, and realizing that the methods that are used within these spaces at that time were still exactly the same that were used in all other aspects of economic activity. So, and my there's this one quote, and I know it's overused, but this idea that you can't solve the problems from the same place or the same mindset that created them. There is somehow a shift necessary. So I was looking for that. What's that shift? What are the different abilities we need in order to truly work differently and contribute to sustainable solutions? What does that look like? What does that need? And
Mm.
so that's what brought me into mediation work, into nonviolent communication, which made the biggest impact, I would say, on my personal journey and then also on my work. And that led me to coaching. So through mediation, and I have to mention yoga first, yoga meditation practice. Then and that was happening simultaneously while I was still in my previous role. I trained to become a teacher. I started teaching, so I was teaching in the mornings and then leaving the center in my suit to go to work. And so that happened for a while simultaneously. But then after stepping out of that role, I fully committed to this learning path. So it was, I think, maybe 2 years or so of really honing these skills, and that led me to coaching and coach training. So, and then my first, when I started my practice, it was very clear that belonging is at the heart and center of this work. And I really define belonging not only as finding our place, but really also finding that inner acceptance, or relating to ourselves in a way that welcomes all our parts and all our interests and all our, what makes us unique. And so my initial, and it's still going on, but my practice is called Home Within, because for me it's really about this sense of finding home, and whatever that looks like for everybody. Yeah.
Yeah. And how do you know that you found your home within?
I think I've started seeing it as a process. Like, I don't call it like a destination anymore. I think that was maybe what I was struggling with in this culture shock period. I was thinking I need to arrive, like I need to be fully, all doubts have to vanish, and I just have to be clear all the time. Uh, there was this high expectation for home within being a final place to find, and now I really define it as a process or as a practice, like just to see what is it that now in this period that I'm in right now, what does that mean, and and how can I cultivate that. And so for example, at the moment, this is here living on a farm, and having that sense of going outside and being, for me, belonging really has become a lot about connecting with nature around me. So that's one thing, how I now say that I really feel at home within. And it's not, doesn't mean that there's no, of course not, it doesn't mean that there's no struggle, or there's no, it's an ongoing practice for me, I would say. Yeah.
And what helps you in your practice, in this ongoing practice? Do you have some specific tools that you often go back to?
Yeah, so many. So I mean, the most prominent one right now is the nature connection piece. Then I do have my yoga and meditation practice. It's been fluctuating over the years, and it looks different now, but that's always there as a tool. And I do notice that when I lose that, I feel far further away from myself, if that makes sense. So that's the one where the effect is the most immediate. But the other is this nonviolent communication practice has been uh, really important for me. It's really about connecting with needs, and not only mine, but those of others around me. And that's been a way for me to actually bridge also cultural difference, to say, I might not be able to communicate, I might not be able to exactly express myself or hear the other person, but I can, become aware of needs, of universal human needs, and what they might be trying to accomplish in any situation. And even for myself, to become really, it's almost like a meditation for me, and it's hard now maybe to explain it when the without first explaining what nonviolent communication is. But it's almost like a meditation for me, I would say. But it helps with emotional regulation and with with self-awareness ultimately. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
It does. I also feel like, do we need another
Yeah,
episode
it's
just on
so
nonviolent
beautiful.
communication? But
Yeah.
we leave that for another day. Um, I'm curious. What elements do you need to feel or to see in any new environment that you get into? And that could mean also a
Mhm.
new group of people, to feel that you belong there.
Mhm. It's mostly the inner practice for me now. To I think from having been looking for belonging as if this is something that somebody bestows on me, from externally, I've reoriented it towards how how can I belong here? And if I don't, even if I feel out of place, or if I feel shame, for example, really, I'm so curious also about the human emotion of shame, because it's one of my nonviolent communication teachers. speaks about this, that our when there's shame present, it's often because we have a need to belong and it's not fulfilled. So to navigate those emotions that come up, but so really befriending my inner life, my emotional life, that's what's been the biggest source of belonging for me now, because that I can take with me, wherever I go. I can i can work with that, and it's even sweeter, of course. It's even more beautiful if there's a sense of really being in surrounded by people who maybe have similar outlooks, and that's where that social piece comes in, and that's like the cherry on top. But I feel the main crucial criteria for me in belonging is cultivating that for myself, that sense of I belong here. I can all parts of me are welcome here in my own experience, not for anybody else, but for me. Yeah. Yeah.
I love it. I love it. Yeah. Right. I think it's time to wrap
Mm.
up for today. I'm really so feeling so grateful that we've had this conversation. I feel it's been overdue, like I said at the start, but also I'm very excited because I got to learn new things
Right.
about you, and I thought I knew everything.
Yay! I loved it. Thank you for having me. And as you could have maybe, it's so beautiful to reflect on this out loud, because a lot of this happens otherwise silently, inwardly. And now that I'm voicing it, I'm realizing there's probably a lot of people who are experiencing pieces of this, maybe not in the exact same configuration, but pieces of this in their own realities. So yeah, it's yeah, I think conversation is another big piece of belonging. So you've contributed to that for me today. Thank you. Yeah.
Oh, I'm really glad. And I agree. I think, I mean, obviously for me, there's been so much learning out of all the episode and amazing conversations with the Belonging Project podcast. And I really think that each conversation in its own way with each guest is really making me think of new dimensions, or even it's making me think of my own story in a different angle, and it's not something that I would have done on my own. So yes, definitely I agree with what you said. Talking it out loud, talking it through out loud, having a conversation about belonging can really bring you to a new depth. So
Thank you.
thank you so much for sharing your story, Kerstin, and trusting us with
My
it. I'm
pleasure.
really
Thank you so
grateful.
much for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.